Cookie, this is a Mott's 2022. Good year. Oh, hi everybody. Welcome to the first episode of JL's Book Club, where we don't talk about Fight Club because I haven't read Fight Club. This will not be your conventional book club book review show. There are a few rules, obviously. The first is there will be no graphic novels because those are comic books, not books. And of course we will not be doing YA fiction. Why? Because that's for kids. And last but not least, despite this perhaps being ableist, we won't be doing audiobooks because this is a book club and not story time. So, with those few rules set aside, we will be reviewing books each month, maybe one or two a month, depending on how long the books are and how much time I have to read. But sometimes it'll be a new book. Sometimes it'll be a book I bought a few years ago that I just haven't gotten to. Sometimes it'll be a classic. I have Moby Dick on my shelf right now. I've never read it. As you may know, Moby Dick is the pictorial book of the 90s and 2000s DJ Moby about his penis. So that should be an interesting episode a few months from now. But I figured to start the book club, we could do a few introductory things. I'm going to be discussing on this episode my top books of 2021. We'll get that out of the way and then move on to books of a more recent vintage in terms of when I've read them. But before that, I want to go through my book Hall of Fame, which is, there's really no set criteria for it. It's just my favorite books. Now, they're not necessarily like the 10 or 12 best books I've ever read, but they're more like some of them are the best books I've ever read. Some of them are just top books in certain categories, just to give you a flavor and a variety of different books you can choose from as you're catching up on JL's Book Club. And importantly, at the end of each episode, I will preview what book I will be reading for the next episode, so you can either get it and read along and then know what's going on for the next episode, or not. Or you can just eagerly anticipate what I'm going to say about the books. I try not to, I will obviously hopefully like a lot of the books that I read, but there's no guarantee. So if I decide to announce a book for the next month and then I read it and it ends up being a huge piece of shit, then maybe that'll make for a more entertaining episode. So before we get to the top books of 2021, let's do the JL Book Hall of Fame, shall we? So, in the JL Book Hall of Fame, in no particular order, Reaganland by Rick Perlstein. Reaganland is here representing his quadrology about the rise of the modern Republican movement. I recommend all four books: Before the Storm, Nixonland, Invisible Bridge, and Reaganland. The next one is the first part of the Taylor Branch trilogy about the Martin Luther King years, called Parting the Waters. This as well is representing the entire trilogy, which was took me about 7 months to read, to be honest, because they are very dense, but it is, I think, a required reading for every American. The next two are read these in school, and they were awesome books. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, or maybe it's pronounced differently, I've never bothered to learn, and Animal Farm by George Orwell, because unlike 1984, I prefer my anti-socialism propaganda through animals. The next book is my single favorite fiction book of all time, The Bonfire of the Vanities by Tom Wolfe. I am, as you know, a comedian and also a former Bronx assistant district attorney. And I would not be able to write a book as great and funny as The Bonfire of the Vanities, which is a humorous book about the Bronx district attorney's office, among other things. Open by Andre Agassi, the single best sports book I have ever read, period. Now, one of the comedy books I would recommend, a lot of people like comedy memoirs, but the two that are my favorite are on this list. It's not that this is one of the greatest books I've ever read, but as far as, because I'm a comedian, you might care about my perspective on comedy memoirs. How to Talk Dirty and Influence People by Lenny Bruce. My favorite thing about it was that it was written, unlike many memoirs, at the end of a long, successful career through rosy glasses. This was written towards the end of his life when he was just sort of emerging as a comedy star. So I just appreciated the honesty and the perspective. Next is my favorite nonfiction book of all time, The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright. It's about Al-Qaeda, the road to 9/11 and Al-Qaeda, and it reads like an incredible spy novel. The other comedy book on the list is called Becoming Richard Pryor by Scott Saul. as raw a biography of any comedian as I've ever read, and that in part is because of Richard Pryor's raw upbringing, but it leads right up until about 1980 when Richard Pryor became sort of a superstar. Just a great read for anybody who wants a really juicy and dark tale of a rising comedian. Motley Crue, The Dirt, is one of those books where I read it and I just assumed, like, because so many fans of the book turned out to be, scummy people, I said, oh, this is probably just going to be some nonsensical bro book. Incredible read. Incredibly raw and honest, and definitely details some hardcore criminality, but a brilliantly sort of structured book in that each member of Motley Crue writes different chapters so that their stories overlap and you see some inconsistencies, but it was whoever came up with that narrative choice. Brilliant idea. Next on the list, representing the Ron Chernow section of my library, is Grant. His incredible biography on Ulysses S. Grant. Loved this book. Took me about 7 weeks to read over many trips to Starbucks several years ago. And last is one you might not expect, but it's in a great book that makes you respect people you hate, called Cokeland. Now, unlike Jane Mayer's excellent book Dark Money, which also focuses on the nefarious activities of the conservative mega donors, the Koch brothers, Cokeland is sort of a business book which shows, and honestly I'm forgetting right now which one it was. I think Charles Koch was the mastermind Koch brother. I think he's the one still alive, but it shows his and their business genius, and then how it kind of warps into this libertarian dystopian vision for America. But Cokeland by Christopher Leonard, outstanding book that makes you sort of respect without becoming fans of horrible people. Okay, so now that you know the JL Book Hall of Fame, let's do the top 3 books that I read in 2021. Number 3 was the highest ranking fiction book. I tend to not read a lot of fiction, but I'm going to try and do a little bit more of that for JL's book club. But the number 3 book that I read last year had numbers in it. 2034. A novel of the next World War. Which rhymes. I don't think that was intentional. But this is by Elliot Ackerman and Admiral, put some respect on his name, James Stavridis. And basically this is a book that I bought because my friend Pete Dominick had the authors on his podcast. And I listened and I thought, oh, it sounds interesting, and I want to support guests of Pete if I can, if it makes Pete look good. So I bought this book, and I will say this, it's kind of scary. And it reads like a Dan Brown novel, like a good one, not a shitty one. And it is a quick read. It's, 300 pages? Not even 300 pages. Apparently Elliot and the Admiral were a little too busy to write a big, long book. But it reads like a Dan Brown novel, and it's basically just about how China is potentially going to eat our lunch militarily with cyber technology. Interestingly enough, Russia is sort of portrayed as a global dick in the book, just kind of no real power, but just enough power to mess things up. India has a surprise role in this one, look out. And it is just it's the kind of book where you don't put it down, because each chapter, it's like, oh, these 5 pages lead to another thing. Well, I'll keep reading a little bit more. So it's very addictive in that way. It's a little scary, it's exciting, and I really, really liked it. So I was happy I didn't have to just be like, I bought this book to make Pete's show look good. I actually really, really enjoyed it. So I don't know when it'll be on paperback for all my cheap fans, but here it is, 2034. A novel of the next World War. Let's hope not. Now, the number 2 book I read in 2021 seemed like a shoo-in for the number 1 spot until I read another book even later in the year. And for some of you who listen to the Righteous Prick podcast, this first episode may be like, oh, I've heard JL talk about this already. Well, calm down. Some people haven't. I've got at least 4 subscribers who didn't hear it on the podcast. But the number 2 book that I read in 2021 is Zero Fail, The Rise and Fall of the Secret Service by Carol Leonnig, Washington Post reporter. Here it is. See that? Now this is a fat book. Okay, so if you take public transit and you want to look like a real substantial person, maybe this is the one you want to pick up. But it is a sort of history of the Secret Service with a a decent focus on 21st century Secret Service activities. And I just think it is incredible history. I keep, if I had an agent, I would be yelling at them to get me a role in the either TV or movie adaptation. I know the rights have been sold to somebody to adapt it, because I think I could play I have the look, I have the angry eyebrows, the rigid posture, and the sort of law enforcement dickhead face that could probably make me somebody very good in this movie. He's the guy who goes to Colombia, and I can do either. I can be the guy having sex with prostitutes in Colombia, or I can be the agent who's a total square who rats out his fellow agents. Very versatile performer I am. Anybody who hasn't seen my 3.5 minutes on Billions, go check it out. But I don't want to get into, it's an incredible history, very readable, it hits this sort of cross-section of very good, well-reported, well-researched history and tea-spilling gossip. And I thought it was awesome. So there, number 2 book of the year, highly recommend, 0 fail. You didn't fail, Carol, if I can call you Carol. I would call this 100 success, not 0 fail. That's book critic jokes. And now the number 1 book of 2021 was really almost no contest, and I did not expect to like it as much as I did. I bought it because I was like, okay, let's see what this is about. It's called Alpha, and no, it's not a self-help book by some douchebag podcaster about how you can unleash your inner bro. Alpha, Eddie Gallagher and the War for the Soul of the Navy SEALs by David Phillips. Here it is. Now, when you read a book like this and it's got Eddie Gallagher, a notorious piece of shit Navy SEAL, it almost looks like you're on the train or bus reading like, hey, what's that book about? Is that book about how I can be like a super duper bro, like learning Navy SEAL tactics? No, it's kind of not exactly super favorable to the Navy SEALs, although many SEALs come off very good in the book. The main subject, Eddie Gallagher, who you may remember as a war criminal, although his trial turned out to be an incredible kind of courtroom drama moment. And he was also a favorite of Donald Trump because he was white, violent, and people with decency hated him. So that's like the triple threat for becoming a huge, having Trump as a huge fan of yours. But this book is riveting, intense, leaves you with your jaw open at several times, incredibly well written, incredibly well sourced, so it seems. And it was like a no-brainer for my number 1 book of the year. So, I know you've been with me so far, but treat this like a podcast where you get to look at me in my smoking jacket. So, if you're just, you don't have to look at me while I do this. This will be the audio book portion of the show. But I figure for each month I want to find a representative passage from the book that just is so good that it'll make you, if you're not sure, you'll hear these words and go, oh, I got to get that book immediately. So this is a decently long passage. It's a couple of pages in the book. But it is the moment in the book where I was enjoying it, and I just kind of went, holy shit. This just went up another level. So, to set the stage, basically the SEAL team crew of Eddie Gallagher has basically come to the realization, most of them, that he is some combination of liar, psychopath, and scumbag. And he is their leader, and there's a chain of command and everything. And so, just to set the scene. And I may mispronounce some of these names, and if so, so be it. Hopefully, if any Navy SEALs are fans of the JL Max Plus Prime, with respect, I didn't mean to. You can call me Gene Lewis if you want, we can make it even. Eddie found Portier, I don't know, Sidney Poitier? No, rest in peace. Eddie found Portier and told him that this shit needed to end. He was kicking Arrington out of the platoon. That day, Squad 1 had just started a rest rotation at the safe house an hour outside of the city. Arrington, Miller, Dill, and Tolbert were catching up on the things they couldn't do in Mosul. Email, laundry, fixing gear. Miller was in the kitchen when a text message arrived from Portier. Tell Arrington to pack his stuff, it read. He's going to another platoon, and we're getting a new J-TAC to replace him. What the fuck is this shit, Arrington said as soon as he heard. He stormed into the kitchen where Miller still had his phone in his hand. He didn't like Eddie and knew the feeling was mutual, but he didn't want to leave Alpha. The platoon had only about a month left in the deployment, and much of that would be taken up by packing and inventorying all their stuff. Effectively, the job was done. By the time a new JTAC arrived and learned the ropes, it would be time to go home. This was just a way for Eddie to screw him. Arrington hadn't done anything wrong. He was a top JTAC and had never complained about missions. He had even kept his mouth shut about going back to the towers over and over. All the shit Eddie was doing, and Arrington was getting fired? Fuck that, he told Miller. There's some harsh language in this book, just if there are any kids who are fans of the JL Max Plus Prime content. The other guys heard the commotion and gathered in the kitchen. Arrington was a respected guy who was good at his job. Well, then he shouldn't get into stand-up comedy because he'd really be pissed then. They all agreed trying to replace him seemed like a ridiculously bad move, even for Eddie. Miller texted Portier and to try to get him to change his mind. The senior SEALs in the squad crowded around to hear Portier's response. No dice, Miller told them, looking at his phone. I guess Eddie's really pissed. The guys started to grumble, but the sheriff quieted them down. He wanted to avoid an all-out insurrection. Look, I agree kicking Arrington out of the platoon is stupid, he said, but Eddie's the chief. It's his call. We can't just tell him no. Miller was trying to find a way to flank the chief, but didn't see one. Dalton Tolbert stiffened as he listened. His upbringing had made it easy to spot treachery disguised as the system. No, Tolbert said. No way. Nope. Joe's not going anywhere. We have to fight this. This is bigger than Arrington, he said. Eddie had straight up murdered people. Portier wasn't doing shit about it. Tolbert believed Alpha could still bring Eddie to justice when they got home, but only if they stuck together. Let Arrington go, and who would be next? Eddie would dismantle Alpha piece by piece. He would send them to new assignments and probably say bad things about them, quietly, to their new chiefs. He would make it look like a courtesy. Heads up, you have a real turd coming. Side note, turd is a common insult in my home that I use to describe both my girlfriend and my dog Cookie. She, in turn, uses it against me. It's playful, but when I read this book, I now had to distinguish if I use the word turd as a playful one, but if I meant it in a more serious way, like you'd really mess something up, I would go, you're a real turd. And I mean that in the military sense, because turd in this book, you find out, is like, oddly enough, for guys murdering people, it's kind of funny that turd is like the biggest insult, but apparently it's a huge insult. So, he would say the guys had been afraid to fight in Mosul. As strangers in new platoons, they would have no credibility. Everyone would look at them like disgruntled cowards. The guys from Alpha would be alone, with no one around to vouch for them. At that point, if they tried to tell anyone that the great Eddie Gallagher was really a screw-up and a murderer, who would believe them? Eddie would be free to bury the whole thing. Now, a fight ensues here, and I know this is probably droning on. Eddie shows up, there's a fight, and I'll just cut to the final paragraph of this section that really made me go, wow. And then we're done with this first installment. It was the last thing Miller wanted to hear, but he knew they were right. Since the day 5 months ago, before when Miller arrived in Iraq with Eddie, the chief had grown more unhinged. It was totally reasonable to be ready with a gun. At the same time, it was insane to even talk about shooting another Navy SEAL. The SEALs were a brotherhood. Their training taught them to protect one another at all costs. Miller didn't want to kill Eddie. At the same time, he didn't want to put responsibility on any of the other guys. He was their leader. It was on him. He grudgingly agreed. Just a few weeks before the end of what was billed as a dream deployment, he was prepared, if necessary, to shoot his own chief. Ooh! Well, look at that. If you're just sitting there going, "What's the big deal?" Then maybe book club isn't for you. Maybe you should be in, some other comedian's audio book club or a graphic novel coffee group. Okay. So I'm actually going to make big news on the first episode of JL's book club. I am officially inducting Alpha into the JL Book Hall of Fame. This isn't going to be something that happens every episode or even every year. But Alpha, congratulations. Your book will forever hang in the den/home office of J.L. Cauvin. Congratulations, JL Book Club Hall of Fame Alpha by David Phillips, who I don't think is on Twitter, because I would tag him and hope to get a retweet. So there you go, right there, right on top of books about Reagan and Al-Qaeda. So that concludes this episode, the inaugural episode, the premiere episode, however you want to say it, of JL's Book Club, where we don't talk about Bruno because Encanto was not a good movie. So next month's installment, or next episode, like I said, there may be one episode or two a month, will be Invisible Child by Andrea, or if she's pretentious, Andrea Elliott. So look forward to that, or don't, but hopefully you do. So until next time, remember, books, they're like documentaries for smart people.